And just like that, we yet again have a brand new chapter of One Punch Man to enjoy. With the previous chapter, we had the ever-heated power struggle between Bang and his former protege turned destructive monster, Garo. These two would go blow for quite some time before Garo began to assume the stance of a technique his former master had sealed away long ago. What is known to be the Explosion Release Fist, a technique he was able to grasp with only but a single reading of the scroll containing it, and a sight that would remind Bang of his rugged past, as Bang too was quite a troublemaker in his youth, an out-of-control martial artist that beat down anyone he presumed to be strong, a direction that warranted his big brother Bomb's intervention. The two would indeed fight, and after Bang's defeat, he reflected on his life and decided to follow a different path. He sealed the Explosion Release Fist and instead developed the Water Stream Rock Smashing Fist. He opened his dojo and overall made his brother very proud. When news of the Hero Hunter began to spread, Bang insisted on handling the issue by his lonesome, but Bomb managed to convince Bang to let him tag along for the sake of protecting his own dojo. What was ultimately just an excuse. However, in the present, Bang was being overwhelmed. Now, he could have very well resorted to using the dreaded technique of his youth, but refused to do so. However, in the midst of all this, he would gradually begin to communicate with Garo by way of each successive movement. And to him, Bang would convey that after all this was said and done, he intended to retire from heroism, and furthermore hoped that the two of them would be able to become master and disciple once more as well. A fresh start. A sentiment that would cause there to be a literal break in the hardened exterior of Garo. Elsewhere, however, Genos was being torn limb from limb by the Black S's as Tornado was being jumped as well. Genos was desperate and would manage to take out 3 of them in his hopeless flailing. However, there were still 444 billion, 100 million, 712,000, and 554 of these things remaining. Victory was far from possible. The two heroes would be taunted and stomped out until a certain sound would catch the army of monsters' collective attention. With this latest chapter titled The Greatest Obstacle, we would open up to a spread of our various forces still at play here as the text reads, "In the midst of battle, evil awakens." And from there, we would resume the carpet bombardment of Homeless Emperor upon our struggling swordsmen. They were desperately fighting for their lives here, putting their all into each and every swing as Homeless would recognize their stubbornness. He'd furthermore admit that controlling the temperature of his blast was a difficult task when simultaneously attempting to maintain a certain rhythm. However, such a thing may be considered practice after all, considering he planned on exterminating billions of people after this current conflict. A terrifying prospect that further puts into perspective how much is on the line here. And all the while, Homeless was charging up what looked like a death ball that continuously rained smaller yet entirely devastating blasts of power as well. Atomic Samurai student would defend against these attacks and call out to his master, who would respond by saying that he only needed them to keep it up for a little while longer while he figured out how to unsheath the blade. From here, Atomic would recall a previous conversation with Nichiren on the same subject. As it turns out, the fabled Sunblade was a telepathic sentient blade. One that actually gauged its wielder, deciding if they were worthy of possessing its power. That if one isn't accepted, unsheathing the blade would be an impossibility. And to Atomic at the time, the prospect of such a mythological sword sounded like a fairy tale. But now as he clutched the hilt with his very own hands, he understood. He could feel as it surged from within his very being. Homeless Emperor would then launch the entirety of the aforementioned death ball at the group, an attack that they absolutely had no chance at repelling. Atomic would seek an answer from the Sunblade as well. He questioned what sort of blade it was and what sort of vessel was it willing to lend its power to. And in that very moment, what came to mind was the man he considered to be his rival, Bang, a master of his craft who mentally may be likened to a stream of water. And so with this, Atomic Samurai would in turn have his mind be akin to a reflective water surface, furthermore dispelling the explosive sound of said surface to an unparalleled state of concentration. And with this, the Sunblade would respond. As in a flash, Atomic would go from simply believing in the legend to becoming one himself, as he split the massive ball of death to everyone's shock. As this one massive cleave would then reveal itself to in fact be an innumerable number of them, as Atomic remained at its former center. The power he now wielded was awe-inspiring, if not wholly unsettling. This is the evil previously described. In response to this, Homeless Emperor would shift his attention to Atomic entirely and send countless spheres of energy at him, all of which being thwarted with ease as Atomic cut the distance faster than Homeless could blink. The blade had then drawn blood that day. Not that of Homeless, mind you, but rather Golden S, who came to his allies' defense. The blade had cut into the forearm all along the body and diced the entirety of the ground beneath them. Homeless had been pushed back, and at this point, Golden S would recognize the malice behind his opponent's power. So much so that he would immediately question if this was a result of monsterization, but would just as quickly come to his senses and deduce that it might just be because of this new sword of his. And so with that, the only logical conclusion to be made was to break the sword, and so he clutched onto the blade, which suddenly shifted to be like a whip, and entirely cleaved Golden S's arm in two, which is a way bigger deal than it looks, as this was effectively the simultaneous deaths of 12 trillion Black S's. And mind you, prior to this stage of the battle, the S's were straight up bullying Atomic. I mean, he couldn't even take out one. But despite this tremendous feat and the fear he had now placed in his enemies, Atomic would suddenly sheath the blade as a swelling of power would be seen and gradually diminish in size, as out of nowhere, Atomic would violently cough up blood. As it turns out, he assimilated with the blade and it had completely taken over his spirit. But now, having seen the danger Atomic poses, both Homeless and Gold would rally to destroy him while he's weakened. Atomic would immediately tell his student to take Mustachio and make a run for it. Meanwhile, Homeless had charged up yet another terrifying ball of death as Golden S would approach. It was clear to him that Atomic was all out of strength. He'd furthermore tell all the remaining heroes to form an orderly line and await their deaths one by one. However, to interrupt this proclamation, they too would hear the sound. This was the sound of the King engine revving up as the strongest man on Earth, King himself, would stand before this collection of calamities given form. Genos, who was limbless and shielding Tornado with his own body, would be relieved to know that the mighty King had finally entered the fray. Meanwhile, the Black S's would bring up the rumor that King had destroyed Elder Centipede with a single attack. What we of course know to have actually been the doing of Saitama. Metal Bat would appear as well, but rather than entering the ongoing battle, he would remain on standby considering King would be more than able to handle things by his lonesome. And so he figured the best approach would be to call off any of the fleeing stragglers that would inevitably arise, as King would face the monsters down with his expression and body unwavering. At this point, some of the Black S's were getting impatient and irritated by this show of bravado and would bring up the satisfaction of beating down the world's strongest human. However, Golden S would tell them to stand down for now and not act rashly, as before them was the Hero Association's strongest fighter. He was King, the greatest obstacle. They needed to be more cautious with him than even Tornado at full power. And so with that, they all decided that they needed to face him as a collective force. In response to this, King's expression would finally shift to that of a single chuckle. Now mentally, King was absolutely freaking out. He had no idea what he was doing, and even if Genos was in trouble, it wasn't like he could do anything about it. But the monsters would recognize the laugh and assume King was looking down on them. But he absolutely was not. He wanted no part in all of this. These monsters were well beyond the typical sort, and they were so strong that his name alone would not suffice here. At this point, he was sure that his days were over. With that, he would think to himself, if only Saitama was here. Which would be followed by, actually, where the hell is Saitama? Which I'm sure plenty of us have been thinking for a while now. Not in terms of where he is exactly, but when is he actually going to show up? And just then, he would hear his name be called from behind from what he hoped was Saitama. However, in reality, it was just Child Emperor and Prisoner emerging from underground, happy to see him and believing the day to finally be saved. Meanwhile, King was over here just sweating bullets, and that was the chapter. Okay, so before I did say that I hope we don't see every perspective on the battlefield before seeing Saitama emerge, but you know what, I take it all back. this chapter was phenomenal. Atomic Samurai was way too cool to be overlooked. I mean, I am now super invested in seeing what he'll be capable of with the Sunblade going forwards. I also think it's really interesting how this series is able to play with our expectations so thoroughly. Typically, King arriving is essentially confirmation that Saitama is just over the horizon, so to now have King betting on that fact as well, only to be disappointed, is pretty damn clever. One Punch Man chapters are always an absolute treat to read and furthermore cover, so I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please be sure to subscribe to Plot Armor with notifications on to be here for plenty more, because when it comes to bringing you some of the best One Punch Man content on the platform, Plot Armor has you covered. As always, I'm SliceOfOtaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.